Deep in the Montana high country, old veteran Thomas Mercer returned to the ranch he'd abandoned 30 years ago, expecting nothing but dust and regret. The place was a graveyard of memories, sagging fences, a collapsed barn, and silence so thick it pressed against his chest. He'd brought his German shepherd, Ranger, thinking the loyal dog would be company on this final goodbye before signing the sale papers. But the moment Ranger's paws touched the parched earth, everything changed. The dog ignored the ruined structures entirely, his focus locked on a distant corner near the old dried creek bed. He began to dig frantically, whining with an urgency Thomas had never heard before. This wasn't curiosity. This was desperation. What had been buried on this land for 3 decades that only his dog could sense? Why was Ranger so determined to expose it? And what secret would shatter everything Thomas thought he knew? The old pickup truck groaned as it turned off the paved county road onto a rutted dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance in 3 decades, and Thomas Mercer, at 68 years old, felt every jostle and bump in his bones like echoes of a past he'd tried to outrun. His hands, weathered and scarred from both war and work, gripped the steering wheel with a tension that had nothing to do with the rough road and everything to do with the destination that lay ahead. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd, whose coat was a striking blend of rich sable and cream, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on the landscape rolling past the dusty window. Thomas was a tall man, though age had bent him slightly forward, his frame still holding the lean strength of his Marine years. His close-cropped grey hair and weathered face, lined deeply around his clear blue eyes, spoke of a life lived hard and without compromise. He wore what had become his uniform in retirement, a faded denim shirt over a plain white undershirt, worn jeans held up by a leather belt with a tarnished brass buckle, and scuffed work boots that had seen better days. The truck crested a small rise, and there it was, the Mercer family ranch, spread out in the valley below, like the corpse of a once living thing. The sight hit him with a physical force that made his breath catch. The main house, a 2-story structure his grandfather had built with his own hands in 1947, sagged on its foundation, its windows dark and hollow, like the eyes of a skull. The barn, once painted a proud red, had collapsed on one side, its skeletal frame exposed to the elements. Fences that had once run straight and true now leaned at drunken angles or lay flat on the ground, consumed by decades of harsh Montana winters and blazing summers. The fields that had sustained 3 generations of cattle were now overrun with sagebrush and thistle. Thomas brought the truck to a stop in what had once been the main yard and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was profound and suffocating, broken only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ranger whined softly, sensing his master's turmoil. Thomas reached over and rested a hand on the dog's broad head, drawing comfort from the warm, solid presence. Tomorrow, a real estate agent from some development company would arrive with papers for him to sign, papers that would transfer ownership of this place to strangers who would probably bulldoze every structure and memory into oblivion. The thought brought him an unexpected mixture of emotions, grief for what had been lost, but also a strange relief. For 30 years he had carried the weight of this place, the guilt of abandoning it, and tomorrow he would finally be free. He opened the truck door, and together, man and dog stepped out onto the land that had shaped and ultimately broken the Mercer family. Thomas spent the first hour walking the perimeter of what had once been the heart of the ranch, his boots crunching on the dried grass and gravel, his eyes cataloguing the decay with a surveyor's detachment that barely masked the deeper ache in his chest. Ranger trotted beside him at first, his nose to the ground, processing the thousands of scents that painted an invisible history of this abandoned place. They walked past the main house, its front porch collapsed on one end, past the listing barn with its rusted equipment still visible in the shadows, past the old chicken coop that had become home to nothing but field mice and owls. Thomas expected Ranger to investigate these structures with the natural curiosity of a dog encountering new territory. But instead, the German shepherd remained strangely focused, his attention repeatedly pulled toward the eastern edge of the property. Then, as they rounded the remains of an old storage shed, Ranger's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His head snapped up, his ears pricked forward with laser focus, and his body went rigid with an intensity Thomas had only seen during the dog's working days as a detection animal before his retirement. Without warning, Ranger bolted, not toward the buildings or the overgrown pastures, but toward a remote corner of the ranch that Thomas barely remembered, a desolate stretch near what had once been a creek bed, but was now just a dried scar of cracked earth and scattered stones. "Ranger, heel!" Thomas called out, his voice sharp with authority. But the dog ignored him completely, something Ranger never did. Thomas broke into an awkward jog, his knees protesting, following the grey and cream shape of his companion as Ranger raced across the uneven ground. The dog stopped abruptly at a spot that looked identical to every other patch of sun-baked earth in that forgotten corner, perhaps 200 yards from the nearest structure, and immediately began to dig. But this wasn't the playful exploratory digging of a dog who'd caught the scent of a gopher or found an interesting bone. This was frantic, desperate, driven by something Thomas couldn't understand. Ranger's powerful front legs tore at the hard ground, sending dirt flying behind him in great arcing sprays, his claws scraping against the packed earth, with a sound that set Thomas's teeth on edge. The dog paused only to whine, a high-pitched, urgent sound that vibrated with distress before attacking the ground again with renewed ferocity. "Ranger, stop! Leave it!" Thomas commanded as he reached the spot, but the dog was beyond commands, beyond discipline, possessed by a need that overrode his training and his natural obedience. Thomas grabbed the dog's collar, trying to pull him back, but Ranger's strength, fueled by whatever desperate instinct had seized him, was formidable. The dog looked back at Thomas for just a moment, his amber eyes wild and pleading, communicating something urgent that transcended the barrier between species, and then he returned to his digging with an almost violent determination. Thomas stood there, breathing hard, his hand still gripping the collar, staring down at the widening hole in the earth, and feeling the first cold fingers of unease creep up his spine. In 5 years together, through training and daily life, he had never seen Ranger act this way, and the dog's absolute conviction that something vital lay beneath this unremarkable patch of ground was impossible to ignore. Thomas stood there for another long moment, watching Ranger claw at the earth with a desperation that bordered on anguish, and finally made his decision. He walked back to his truck, his mind racing with questions that had no answers, and retrieved the old folding shovel he kept behind the seat, a military surplus tool that had been with him for decades. Returning to the spot where Ranger continued his frantic excavation, Thomas knelt beside the dog and gently pushed him aside, taking over the work with the more efficient steel blade. The earth was hard and compact, baked by countless summers and compressed by the weight of time, and each shovelful required real effort that made his shoulders burn and his lower back protest. Ranger paced beside him, whining continuously, occasionally darting in to sniff at the growing hole, his entire body quivering with anxious energy. Thomas dug methodically, creating a pit roughly 3 feet across, going deeper with each pass of the shovel. 1 foot down, then 18 inches, the soil changing color slightly as he descended through the layers of sediment. Then, at approximately 2 feet deep, his shovel blade struck something with a dull, metallic clang that reverberated up through the wooden handle and into his arms. The sound was unmistakable, wrong for this place, the clear ring of metal on metal rather than the scrape of steel on stone. Thomas's heart began to beat faster, a heavy thudding in his chest that seemed to echo the impact. He dropped to his knees in the dirt and began using his hands, brushing away the soil with increasing urgency. His fingers finding the edges of something large, rectangular, and solid. Ranger pressed close, his cold nose touching Thomas's arm, a soft, encouraging whine escaping his throat. Thomas cleared away more earth, working carefully now, and within minutes the object was fully revealed. It was a metal lockbox, military issue, the kind used to store sensitive documents or valuable equipment in the field. The box was approximately 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 8 inches deep, constructed of heavy-gauge steel that had oxidized to a deep reddish brown. Rust had claimed the corners and edges, but the body of the box remained intact, and most remarkably, a combination lock still hung from the hasp, corroded but unbroken. Thomas worked his fingers beneath the box and lifted, grunting with the effort. It was heavy, far too heavy to be empty, the weight of its contents shifting slightly inside with a muffled sound. He hauled it out of the hole and set it on the ground beside the excavation, staring at it as if it were a bomb that might detonate at any moment. A chill ran through him, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun beating down on his shoulders. Someone had buried this box deliberately, had chosen this remote corner of the ranch where no one would think to look, had sealed it against time and discovery. The rust, the depth at which it had been buried, the settled quality of the earth above it, all spoke to the same conclusion. This box had been here for decades, hidden and waiting, and whatever secrets it contained had been deemed important enough to bury in the middle of nowhere and leave to the silence of the high country. Thomas carried the heavy metal box back to his truck, Ranger following so closely that the dog's shoulder brushed against his leg with every step, and set it on the tailgate where the fading afternoon light could illuminate his work. The sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged peaks to the west, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, but Thomas barely noticed the beauty of the Montana sunset. His full attention was fixed on the corroded combination lock that stood between him and whatever secrets lay inside this buried container. The lock was old military surplus, the same type he'd seen countless times during his service, a simple 3-dial mechanism that should have been straightforward to open if you knew the code. The brass body had tarnished to a dark greenish-brown, and the numbered dials were stiff, resisting his attempts to turn them, but they still functioned. Thomas wiped his dirt-covered hands on his jeans and stared at the lock, his mind racing through possibilities. On impulse, driven by a growing suspicion he didn't want to name, he carefully turned the dials to his father's Marine Service number, a sequence of digits he'd memorized as a child from hearing it repeated on official forms and documents. He aligned the final number and pulled on the shackle. Nothing. The lock held fast. He tried. His mother's birthday next, then the date she had died, a date that was burned into his memory with the searing permanence of trauma. Still nothing. His fingers moved to the next combination, and this time his hands trembled slightly as he entered the date that represented the worst day of his family's history, the day in 1969 when his older brother David had been killed in Vietnam, cut down by enemy fire in a jungle half a world away from this Montana ranch. Thomas pulled the lock. It didn't budge. Frustration and an emotion he couldn't quite name, something that felt like dread mixed with desperate hope, made his next movements almost frantic. He tried the date his father had died, then his parents' anniversary, then a series of other significant numbers from his family's history. Each attempt met with the same resistance. Finally, more out of desperation than logic, he turned the dials to his own birthday, the numbers that marked the day Thomas Samuel Mercer had entered the world in the spring of 1956. He aligned the last digit, wrapped his fingers around the cold metal shackle, and pulled. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the vast silence of the ranch. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the open lock in his hand, his mind reeling with the implications. His birthday. Someone, and he knew with terrible certainty that someone had been his father, had secured this box with a combination that only Thomas would eventually think to try. Inside the box, protected from 3 decades of moisture and decay, were stacks of documents, their edges yellowed but intact, carefully wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had preserved them against time. There were photographs, their images still visible through the protective covering, and most prominently, a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened with age but solid, lying on top of everything else like a guardian of secrets. Thomas reached in with shaking hands and lifted out the journal, the weight of it somehow far heavier than its physical mass. And in that moment, standing in the dying light with his father's hidden legacy, literally in his hands, he understood that his plans to sell this ranch and walk away forever had just become impossible. Thomas climbed into the cab of his truck as the last light drained from the sky, turning the world into shades of grey and deepening purple, and clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, angling it so the beam illuminated the leather journal that now rested on his lap. Ranger settled on the passenger seat, his body oriented toward the window, his ears alert to every sound that carried across the empty ranch, assuming the role of sentinel so his master could focus on the ghosts emerging from the pages. The journal's first entry was dated March 15th, 1994, written in his father's distinctive, careful script, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship mattered. Thomas recognized it instantly, that slightly cramped style with the precise loops and crosses, and seeing it again after so many years made his throat tighten with emotions he'd thought long buried. The opening words were simple and chilling. "I have discovered something terrible, and I must document it here in case anything happens to me." Thomas read those words twice, his pulse quickening, before continuing. His father wrote about sleepless nights, about noticing strange activity on the neighboring Thornhill Mining Company property that bordered the eastern edge of the Mercer Ranch. Samuel described hearing the distant rumble of heavy trucks in the darkest hours before dawn, the kind of industrial activity that had no business happening at 2 or 3 in the morning. Driven by curiosity and a rancher's natural concern about what his neighbors were doing to the land, Samuel had taken his old binoculars and his camera and had begun his own midnight surveillance. What he documented over the following weeks was laid out in meticulous, damning detail across the journal's pages. Thornhill Mining, a company that officially extracted copper and silver from the mountains and processed it in their facility, was engaged in systematic illegal dumping of toxic waste. Samuel described watching from concealed positions as unmarked tanker trucks arrived under cover of darkness and pumped thousands of gallons of chemical waste directly into abandoned mine shafts that connected to the underground aquifer, the same aquifer that fed every well, every creek, every source of water for the entire valley. The journal entries grew more detailed and more desperate as Samuel's investigation deepened. He had collected water samples from multiple locations, sneaking onto Thornhill property at great personal risk, filling small glass bottles that he then sent to an independent laboratory in Billings for analysis. He had photographed the midnight operations, capturing grainy but unmistakable images of the tanker trucks, the hoses, the deliberate contamination of the groundwater. He documented license plates, dates, times, volumes, building a case with the thoroughness of a prosecutor preparing for trial. The entries spoke of his growing horror as he realized the scope of the crime, the recognition that hundreds of families, including his own, were drinking water that had been poisoned by corporate greed and criminal negligence. Thomas read page after page, his hands trembling in the flashlight's beam, and with each word, the world he thought he understood, the history he thought he knew, crumbled and reformed into something darker and more terrible. And he finally understood why his father had chosen his birthday as the combination. A final message across 3 decades that said this truth was Thomas's inheritance, his burden, and his responsibility to bear. Thomas turned the pages with increasing dread, watching his father's careful documentation transform into something darker as the journal entries progressed into April of 1994. Samuel wrote that after collecting irrefutable evidence of the contamination, after receiving the laboratory results that confirmed catastrophic levels of toxins in the water supply, he had done what any law-abiding citizen would do. He had taken his evidence to County Sheriff William Dutch, a man Samuel had known for 20 years, a man he'd considered a friend. The journal entry from April 8th described that meeting in detail, how Samuel had spread the photographs and lab reports across the sheriff's desk, how he'd explained everything he'd witnessed, and how Sheriff Dutch had listened with what seemed like genuine concern and shock. The sheriff had promised to investigate immediately, had assured Samuel that if his allegations were true, Thornhill Mining would face serious consequences, and had asked Samuel to keep the matter confidential until the official investigation was complete. Samuel had left that meeting feeling vindicated, believing that justice would be served. But the entry from April 15th, exactly 1 week later, told a very different story. Sheriff Dutch had returned to the Mercer Ranch, but he hadn't come alone. He'd arrived with 3 men in expensive suits, lawyers from Thornhill Mining's corporate office, and the tenor of the conversation had been entirely different. There was no talk of investigation or prosecution. Instead, there was an offer, a substantial financial settlement in exchange for Samuel's silence and the surrender of all evidence. They called it a consultation fee, and spoke of misunderstandings and overreactions to standard industrial processes. The sum they offered was significant enough to solve the ranch's financial problems, to secure the family's future. But Samuel had refused without hesitation. He wrote in his journal that night that some things couldn't be bought, that the health of his neighbors, his family, his land, mattered more than any amount of money, and that he would take his evidence to the state authorities if the county wouldn't act. The entries that followed documented the price of that refusal. Anonymous phone calls began, always in the dead of night, always silent on the other end except for breathing, designed to unsettle and intimidate. Then came the dead cattle, 5 head of prime breeding stock found poisoned in the north pasture, their deaths inexplicable and devastating to the ranch's economy. A week later, a fire broke out in one of the storage sheds, destroying thousands of dollars worth of equipment and hay, the fire marshal ruling it accidental, despite Samuel's insistence that he'd smelled gasoline. The journal's tone shifted dramatically through these entries, the careful documentation giving way to something more raw and frightened. Samuel wrote about watching the road at night, about the vehicles that would slow down near his property, then speed away, about the sense of being watched constantly. His handwriting became less controlled, more urgent, and he began to speculate about who could be trusted and who might be in Thornhill's pocket. He wrote about his wife, Margaret's growing fear, about her pleading with him to drop the matter, to take the money and let it go. But Samuel remained adamant that he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent while his neighbors were being poisoned, and Thomas read these entries with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding the burden his father had carried alone in those final months of his life. Thomas woke the next morning with his father's journal still clutched in his hands, having fallen asleep in the truck's cab sometime after midnight, his dreams haunted by images of poisoned water and burning fields. Ranger nudged his arm insistently, needing to stretch and relieve himself, and Thomas climbed stiffly from the truck, his body protesting the awkward sleeping position. After attending to Ranger and splashing cold water on his face from a jug in the truck bed, Thomas made a decision. He needed to understand what had happened in the 3 decades since his father's death, needed to know if the contamination had ever been addressed, and the nearest place to find answers was Cedar Falls, the small town 20 miles north that had always served as the valley's commercial center. The drive took him through landscape that was both familiar and strange, the contours of the land unchanged, but the details all wrong, and when he crested the final hill and saw Cedar Falls spread out in the valley below, his breath caught. The town he remembered, vibrant and bustling, had withered. The old downtown, with its brick storefronts and tree-lined main street, looked like something from a ghost town photograph. More than half the businesses were shuttered, their windows dark or papered over, and the few that remained open had a desperate, hanging-on quality. But on the outskirts, in stark contrast, stood gleaming new construction, modern buildings of steel and glass that seemed completely out of place in this rural Montana setting, and every single one bore the same logo, a stylized mountain with the words Thornhill Development Corporation beneath it. Thomas parked on Main Street and walked with Ranger to the one place that showed signs of life, a diner called the Silver Spoon that he vaguely remembered from his youth. Inside, the decor hadn't changed in 40 years, red vinyl booths and a long formica counter, and behind that counter stood an elderly waitress whose weathered face suggested she'd been pouring coffee in this place for most of her life. Thomas took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee, and asked if he could bring Ranger inside, explaining he was a service dog, and the waitress, whose name tag read Dorothy, nodded and brought a bowl of water for the German Shepherd without being asked. After she'd poured his coffee, Thomas took a breath and asked the question he'd driven here to ask. "I'm doing some research about water quality issues in the valley, going back to the 1990s. Do you remember anything about contamination concerns or health problems from that time?" The effect of his words was immediate and chilling. Dorothy's friendly expression vanished, replaced by something carefully blank. She glanced toward the kitchen, making eye contact with someone Thomas couldn't see, then looked back at him with eyes that held a warning. "I've lived here my whole life," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed. "And I don't remember anything like that. Water's always been fine." Thomas pressed gently. "I've heard there might have been some issues with the old Thornhill mining operations. Maybe some families who got sick." Dorothy picked up a rag and began wiping the already clean counter, not meeting his eyes. "Mister, I don't know where you heard that, but it's just not true. Thornhill has been good to this town, provides most of the jobs we have left. I think you might be thinking of somewhere else." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning, and Thomas understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't ignorance, forgetfulness, but rather a silence that had been carefully constructed and maintained, a wall of deliberate amnesia that protected something dark. Thomas returned to the ranch just after noon, his mind churning with the implications of Dorothy's deliberate silence, and found a sleek black sedan already parked in the yard, its polished surface incongruous against the backdrop of decay and abandonment. A woman stood on the sagging porch, her back to him, as she examined the damaged structure, and she turned at the sound of his truck, her movement fluid and practiced. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in an expensive charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than Thomas's truck, her dark hair pulled back in a flawless bun, her makeup subtle but perfect, and everything about her screamed corporate polish and calculated professionalism. She smiled as Thomas climbed out of the truck, Ranger immediately taking up a protective position at his side, and she extended a manicured hand. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Claire Donovan. I apologize for arriving early, but I was in the area and thought we might get our business concluded efficiently." Thomas shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the way her eyes assessed him with the practiced evaluation of someone who sized people up for a living. "You're from the development company," he said, and she nodded, producing a business card from her jacket pocket that read, "Claire Donovan, Senior Acquisitions Manager, Thornhill Development Corporation." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. She gestured toward the porch. "Shall we discuss the details? I have the contracts in my car." They sat at opposite ends of a weathered bench that groaned under their weight, and Claire opened a leather portfolio, withdrawing a thick stack of papers. "Mr. Mercer, Thornhill Development is prepared to offer you $850,000 cash for this property, with closing in 30 days. That's substantially above the appraised value of $320,000. The number was staggering, more money than Thomas had ever imagined this broken-down ranch could command, and Claire clearly expected him to be overwhelmed. She continued without waiting for his response, her tone shifting subtly from friendly to insistent. "This is a very generous offer, and frankly, it's time-sensitive. We have development plans that are on a tight schedule, and we need to secure this parcel immediately. If you could sign today, we can have the earnest money in your account by tomorrow morning." Thomas looked down at the contracts, then at Claire's perfectly composed face, and asked the question that had been forming since he'd seen her business card. "Why does Thornhill want this land so badly? There's nothing here but ruins." Claire's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "We're assembling a large parcel for a resort development. Your property is a key piece." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Mr. Mercer, I'll be frank with you. This sale would be beneficial for everyone involved. Some properties carry unfortunate histories, complications that are best left buried and forgotten. Thornhill is willing to pay a premium to ensure those complications don't resurface." The threat was wrapped in silk, but it was unmistakable. Thomas met her gaze steadily, his marine training keeping his voice calm and level. "I need time to think about it." Claire's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing frustration and something darker beneath. "Mr. Mercer, I strongly advise you not to wait. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Thomas stood, and Ranger rose with him, the dog's amber eyes fixed on Claire, with an intensity that made her lean back slightly. "I'll be in touch," Thomas said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Thomas waited until Claire's black sedan disappeared down the dirt road before climbing back into his truck, his father's journal now hidden beneath the seat, and drove east toward the property that bordered the Mercer Ranch on the side, closest to where Thornhill Mining had conducted its midnight operations. The mailbox at the entrance to the neighboring spread read Hastings in faded letters, and Thomas remembered vaguely that a family by that name had ranched here when he was young, though he'd been too consumed by his own grief to maintain connections after his parents' deaths. The house was small but well-maintained, a tidy ranch-style structure with a neat garden and a porch where an elderly man sat in a rocking chair, watching Thomas's approach with the cautious attention of someone who lived alone in a remote place. The man was perhaps 75, thin and weathered as old leather, his white hair sparse beneath a battered cowboy hat, and as Thomas climbed out of the truck with Ranger at his side, the old man's eyes widened with recognition. "You're Samuel's boy," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Thomas, I'd know that walk anywhere, same as your father's." Thomas crossed the yard, surprised and moved by the recognition. "Yes, sir. Are you Roy Hastings?" The old man nodded and gestured to another chair. "Sit down, son. It's been a long time." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, and then Thomas said quietly, "I found my father's journal, the one from 1994. Roy Hastings went very still, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his rocking chair, and when he looked at Thomas, his eyes were suddenly bright with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "God help us," he whispered. "I wondered if Samuel had written it down, if he'd left something behind." The story poured out of Roy like water from a broken dam, 30 years of silence finally breached. He told Thomas that in 1994, and the years immediately following, 7 families in the valley lost members to rare, aggressive cancers, the kinds of cancers that doctors said they'd never seen in such concentration in a rural area. His own wife had been one of them, dead within 6 months of diagnosis, her body ravaged by tumors that the oncologist said suggested toxic exposure. Roy described how lawyers from Thornhill Mining had descended on each grieving family like vultures, arriving within weeks of the funerals with contracts and checkbooks, offering settlements that ranged from 50,000 to 200,000 tulos, depending on the family's financial desperation. The settlements came with ironclad non-disclosure agreements, legally binding contracts that forbade the families from ever discussing the payments, the deaths, or any suggestion that Thornhill Mining might have been responsible. Most families, crushed by medical debt and funeral expenses, had taken the money, signing away their right to speak the truth about what had killed their loved ones. Roy had signed, too, he admitted with shame, thick in his voice, because he couldn't afford to keep the ranch without the settlement money, because he'd been broken by grief and didn't have the strength to fight that his friend Samuel Mercer had possessed, and he'd lived with that guilt every day since, watching as the truth was buried under layers of money and legal threats and deliberate forgetting. Roy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and he reached out to place a gnarled hand on Thomas's arm, the touch gentle but insistent, as if he needed the physical connection to deliver what came next. "Son, your mother Margaret was one of them, one of the cancer victims." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making the world tilt sickeningly around him. He'd known his mother had died of cancer in early 1994, had flown home for the funeral on emergency leave from his posting in Germany, but he'd never questioned the cause, never thought to connect her death to anything beyond cruel random chance. Roy continued, his words tumbling out with the urgency of a confession too long delayed. "Your father knew, or at least he suspected strongly. Margaret got sick just weeks after Samuel started noticing the strange activity at Thornhill, and her cancer was one of those rare aggressive types that the doctors couldn't explain. Samuel told me he believed the contamination had killed her, that his wife had died because he and his family had been drinking poisoned water for God knows how many years before he discovered what Thornhill was doing. That's what drove him, Thomas. It wasn't just about being right or about justice in the abstract. It was personal. They'd killed his wife, and he was determined they wouldn't get away with it." Thomas sat frozen, his mind reeling back through memories he'd buried, seeing his mother's rapid decline through new eyes, understanding his father's desperate determination in the journal entries, with a clarity that was almost unbearable. Roy wasn't finished. "After Margaret died, Thornhill's lawyers came to your father, just like they came to the rest of us. They offered him a substantial settlement, more than they'd offered anyone else, maybe because they knew Samuel was the real threat, the one who'd been documenting everything. But Samuel refused them flat, told them to get off his property, and said he'd see them in court and in prison." The old man's voice wavered, thick with emotion. 2 weeks later, Samuel was dead. Heart attack, they said. Sudden and massive. He was only 62 years old, Thomas, strong as an ox his whole life. And then one morning, they found him collapsed in the barn. Roy leaned forward, his eyes boring into Thomas's. "I've never believed it was natural, son. Not then, not now. The timing was too convenient. And I've heard stories over the years about what these big corporations can do when someone threatens them badly enough. I think they killed him, made it look like a heart attack, and there was no one left to fight them." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, hot and unchecked, as Roy continued. "You came home for your father's funeral, stayed 3 days, and then you left and never came back. I don't blame you for that, son. You'd lost both parents in less than a year, and you were young and overwhelmed and probably felt guilty for not being here when they needed you. But that's exactly what Thornhill wanted. They wanted this place abandoned, wanted the evidence buried and forgotten, and for 30 years, that's exactly what happened. Until now." Thomas looked down at Ranger, who pressed against his leg with solid, comforting warmth, and understood with devastating clarity that his entire adult life had been built on a lie, that his parents hadn't died from natural causes, but had been murdered by corporate greed, and that his flight from this place had allowed their killers to escape justice. Thomas drove back to the ranch with Roy's words echoing in his mind, and once there, he retrieved the metal lockbox from where he'd hidden it beneath the truck's seat, carrying it into the cab where the afternoon light could illuminate his work. Beneath the journal, carefully wrapped in additional layers of oilcloth, were the documents his father had preserved, and Thomas unwrapped them with trembling hands, finding several sealed manila envelopes marked with the logo of Mountain States Environmental Laboratory in Billings. The envelopes had remained sealed for 3 decades, their contents preserved in pristine condition by his father's careful preparation. And Thomas opened the first one with a sense of dread that proved entirely justified. The laboratory report was dated April the 20th, 1994, just 3 days before his father's death on April 23rd, and it contained the results of water sample analysis from 15 different locations across the valley, each sample meticulously labeled with GPS coordinates and collection dates in his father's precise handwriting. Thomas had no scientific training, but the numbers on the pages were damning, even to his untrained eye, highlighted in red by the laboratory technicians, with notes that used words like catastrophic, immediate health hazard, and grossly exceeds safe levels. The arsenic levels in samples taken from wells serving residential properties ranged from 150 to 340 parts per billion, when the EPA safe drinking water standard was 10 parts per billion. Lead concentrations reached 87 parts per billion in some samples, nearly 6 times the allowable limit. But it was the industrial solvents that painted the most horrifying picture. Trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, benzene, and a dozen other compounds with long chemical names, all present in concentrations that the lab report stated were consistent with direct industrial discharge and incompatible with human consumption. A separate page contained the laboratory director's personal note, handwritten on official letterhead, addressed to Samuel Mercer. Mr. Mercer, I have been conducting environmental analysis for 30 years, and I have never seen contamination of this severity in a residential water supply. These levels represent an immediate and critical threat to public health. People drinking this water would be at extreme risk for cancers, neurological damage, liver and kidney failure, and birth defects. This contamination did not occur naturally and could not have accumulated through normal agricultural or residential activities. This is industrial poisoning on a massive scale. I urge you to contact state and federal authorities immediately. This laboratory will provide expert testimony if legal action is pursued. Thomas read that note 3 times, in his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper, and then he looked at the date again. April 20th, 1994. His father had received these results, had held in his hands the scientific proof that would have destroyed Thornhill Mining and vindicated everything he'd been fighting for. And 3 days later he was dead. These results, which should have triggered massive investigations and criminal prosecutions, which should have led to evacuations and emergency water supplies and clean-up operations, had instead been buried in a hole in the ground, hidden away where they could harm no one's profits, and Thomas understood with absolute certainty that his father had been murdered to ensure this evidence never saw the light of day. As evening descended over the ranch, painting the ruined buildings in shades of purple and gold, Thomas sat on the tailgate of his truck with the laboratory reports spread around him, and became aware that Ranger's behavior had shifted into something he'd only seen during the dog's working days. The German Shepherd was no longer the relaxed companion of their road trip, but had transformed into a sentinel of unwavering vigilance. Ranger refused to settle, instead maintaining a constant patrol of the immediate area around the truck, his movements economical and purposeful, his head sweeping back and forth as he scanned the perimeter with professional intensity. When Thomas moved, even just to retrieve a water bottle from the cab, Ranger was instantly at his side, positioning himself between Thomas and any potential threat, his amber eyes sharp and assessing. The dog's ears were in constant motion, swiveling to catch sounds that Thomas's duller human hearing couldn't detect, and several times Ranger froze completely, his body going rigid as he stared towards the distant highway that was barely visible as a thin grey line across the valley floor. Each time a vehicle passed on that far-off road, moving at normal highway speeds and presenting no obvious threat, Ranger would emit a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through his chest, a sound of warning and suspicion that spoke to instincts honed through years of training and field work. Thomas watched his companion with growing understanding, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. He'd adopted Ranger 3 years ago from a military working dog retirement program, And while he'd been told the dog had served as a detection specialist, he'd never pressed for details, never really understood what that meant in practical terms. Now, watching Ranger's behavior, he began to comprehend. Detection dogs weren't just trained to find explosives or drugs through scent. They were trained to read environments, to sense danger and wrongness, to trust their instincts when something was fundamentally off about a situation. From the moment they'd arrived at this ranch, from that first step onto the property, Ranger had known something was wrong with this place. The dog had ignored all the obvious points of interest, the buildings and structures that would normally draw a dog's curiosity, and had instead been drawn with unerring accuracy to that remote corner where the evidence lay buried. It wasn't random chance or lucky accident. Ranger's training, his instincts, some combination of scent, detection and behavioral reading that Thomas couldn't fully understand, had led them directly to the truth. The dog had sensed the contamination in the soil, or perhaps the wrongness of something deliberately hidden, or maybe he'd simply read Thomas's own unconscious signals and followed them to their logical conclusion. Whatever the mechanism, Ranger had found what Samuel Mercer had hidden, had accomplished in hours what might have taken Thomas days or weeks or forever to discover on his own. And now, with that truth exposed, Ranger's protective instincts were in overdrive, because the dog understood something that Thomas was only beginning to grasp. They had disturbed something dangerous, had uncovered secrets that powerful people had killed to protect, and the very act of finding the evidence had transformed them from visitors to targets. Thomas had dozed off in the cab of the truck sometime after midnight, the laboratory report secured back in the lockbox beneath his seat, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion despite his racing mind, when Ranger's explosive barking jerked him awake with the disorienting violence of a nightmare made real. The dog was at the window, his hackles raised in a ridge along his spine, his barks sharp and aggressive, the sound of an animal prepared to defend against a serious threat. Thomas sat up, his heart hammering, his hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron he'd placed on the floor, and peered through the darkness toward the ranch gate. Headlights, bright and unwavering, cut through the night, and as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the shape of a large black SUV, expensive and new, completely out of place on this abandoned ranch road. The vehicle stopped just outside the gate, and a man emerged from the driver's side, his silhouette backlit by the headlights, revealing an impressive height and broad shoulders. The man walked toward the truck with the confidence of someone who owned the ground beneath his feet, and as he drew closer, entering the cone of light from Thomas's own headlights, which he'd quickly switched on, Thomas could see him clearly. He was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in what was clearly a custom-tailored suit, despite the late hour, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face strong-featured and aristocratic, and he carried an expensive leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about him radiated wealth, power, and absolute certainty in his own authority. Thomas climbed out of the truck, Ranger immediately at his side, but held in check by a firm hand on his collar, and the man stopped about 10 feet away, maintaining a careful distance from the growling dog. "Mr. Mercer, I apologize for the late hour, but we need to talk. I'm Marcus Thornhill, CEO of Thornhill Development Corporation." He said the name as if it should mean something, as if it carried weight that would make lesser men bow, and Thomas supposed that in most circumstances it probably did. "My grandfather founded Thornhill Mining in 1952, and I've spent my life building on his legacy. I understand you've had some interactions with my acquisitions manager, Ms. Donovan, and I felt this situation required my personal attention." Marcus set the briefcase on the hood of Thomas's truck without asking permission, opened it, and withdrew a document that gleamed white even in the poor light. "Mr. Mercer, I'm prepared to offer you $2.5 million cash for this property, with closing tomorrow. That's triple what we offered this morning, and it's my final offer. Sign tonight, be packed and gone by sunrise, and you'll never have to think about this place again. The money will be wired to any account you specify before you reach the county line." The offer was staggering, life-changing money, the kind of sum that would solve every financial concern Thomas had ever had, and Marcus clearly expected immediate capitulation. When Thomas remained silent, Marcus's expression hardened slightly, the pleasant mask slipping to reveal something colder beneath. "Mr. Mercer, I'm here at midnight, making an offer that's frankly absurd for a property that's worth nothing, and I'm doing it because I believe in handling problems efficiently and generously. Don't make me handle this problem differently." Thomas looked at Marcus Thornhill, standing in the cone of light, at the document that promised wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined, and said simply, "No." The single word hung in the night air like a gunshot, and the effect on Marcus was immediate and profound. The carefully maintained veneer of corporate civility cracked and fell away, revealing something savage and cruel beneath. And when Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness, becoming instead the cold, measured tone of a man delivering an ultimatum he'd delivered before. "Mr. Mercer, you're making a serious mistake, so let me be very clear about your situation. You have no family, no ties to this community, no one who would miss you if you simply disappeared. You're a 68-year-old man living alone on an abandoned property in one of the most remote areas of Montana. Accidents happen out here all the time. People fall, have medical emergencies, get lost in the wilderness. Sometimes they're not found for months, if ever." Marcus took a step closer, and Ranger's growl intensified, but the man didn't seem to notice or care. "You think you've found something, some evidence that your father collected 30 years ago, and you're probably entertaining fantasies about exposing corruption and getting justice for past wrongs. But let me tell you what will actually happen if you pursue that course. First, you'll discover that every official who might have helped you is either retired, dead, or on my payroll. Second, you'll learn that your father's conspiracy theories, because that's how they'll be characterized, have no statute of limitations that matters, because everyone involved is long gone. Third, you'll find yourself buried under legal motions and challenges that will drain whatever resources you have." Marcus gestured dismissively at the ruined ranch around them. "This property, for instance, could be seized through eminent domain for public development. The county could condemn it as environmentally hazardous and prohibit your access. Your truck could fail inspection. Your veterans' benefits could be tied up in bureaucratic reviews. Fighting powerful interests is dangerous, Mr. Mercer, not because of anything illegal, but because the system itself becomes your enemy when you threaten the people who run it." The threat was laid out with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions, who'd spent his entire life watching money and power bend the world to his will. "My grandfather built this company through strength and determination, and I've expanded it into an empire. Do you really think one old man with a grudge and some 30-year-old documents is going to change that? Your father tried, Mr. Mercer, and where did it get him? A heart attack at 62, his wife dead, his son fleeing the state, and his evidence buried in the ground, where it's been rotting for 3 decades. Marcus picked up the document and returned it to his briefcase with deliberate finality. "You have 48 hours to accept this offer. After that, the offer is withdrawn permanently, and you'll face the consequences of your stubbornness. I suggest you spend that time thinking very carefully about whether your father's ghost is worth dying for." Thomas watched Marcus Thornhill's tail lights disappear into the darkness, then climbed back into his truck with hands that trembled not from fear, but from rage, and made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his old cell phone, grateful that he'd driven close enough to the highway earlier to get a signal, and scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in 5 years. Daniel Chen. They'd served together in the same platoon, had survived the hell of Fallujah side by side, and after the Marines, Daniel had gone to law school on the GI Bill. and built a reputation as one of the most aggressive environmental attorneys in the Mountain West. Thomas knew that if anyone could help him, it was Danny. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "This better be life or death, whoever you are." Thomas couldn't help but smile. "It's both, Danny. It's Thomas Mercer." There was a pause. Then Daniel's voice came back, alert and concerned. "Tom? Jesus, it's been forever. What's wrong?" Thomas spent the next 20 minutes laying out everything he'd discovered. His father's journal, the laboratory reports, the contamination, the deaths, the cover-up, and Marcus Thornhill's midnight visit with its thinly veiled threats. He could hear Daniel moving around on the other end, the lawyer clearly getting out of bed and booting up, his computer, the sound of furious typing punctuating Thomas's narrative. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence before Daniel spoke, and when he did, his voice was filled with an excitement that Thomas recognized from their military days, the sound of a man who'd just identified a worthy target. "Tom, this is incredible. I mean, it's horrifying, but from a legal standpoint, you've got everything we need. The documentation, the lab results, the timeline connecting the contamination to the deaths, and now Thornhill himself has made direct threats to you, which gives us witness intimidation. We can reopen this case, file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the affected families, potentially go after them for wrongful death, environmental crimes, and conspiracy. We're talking hundreds of millions in damages. And more importantly, we're talking about criminal charges that could put these people in prison." But then Daniel's tone shifted, becoming serious and heavy with concern. "However, I need you to understand what you're walking into. Thornhill has unlimited resources, political connections, and as you've already seen, they're willing to use violence and intimidation. Going up against them will be brutal and dangerous. They'll attack your credibility, dig into every aspect of your life, and based on what you've told me about your father's death, they might try to ensure you don't make it to trial. You need to get that evidence to a safe location immediately, like right now, tonight. Make copies, send them to multiple locations, get the originals into a bank safety deposit box, and do not, under any circumstances, let them know where you've secured it. And Tom, you need to consider your own safety. These people have already killed, and they'll do it again if they think they can get away with it." Thomas didn't wait for sunrise. He loaded Ranger into the truck, secured the lockbox and all its contents in a duffel bag, and headed west toward Billings, driving through the pre-dawn darkness with the hyper-awareness of a man who knew he was racing against a clock he couldn't see. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and he spent them checking his rearview mirror obsessively, watching for headlights that followed too consistently, for vehicles that maintained the same distance regardless of his speed changes. Billings was awake and bustling by the time he arrived, and his first stop was a 24-hour print shop where he spent $200 making multiple complete copies of every document, every page of the journal, every photograph, and every laboratory report. The young clerk who handled the copying gave him curious looks, but asked no questions, and Thomas left with 3 thick manila envelopes, each containing a complete set of evidence. His next stop was the First Interstate Bank on North 27th Street, a substantial brick building that opened its doors at exactly 8 a.m. Thomas was waiting on the steps with Ranger, and he was the first customer through the door, requesting access to their safe deposit box services. The bank officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led him to the vault and helped him secure a large box, the largest size they offered. Thomas placed the original lockbox with all of Samuel Mercer's evidence inside the steel drawer, watched as it slid into its secured slot in the wall, and pocketed the key with a sense of profound relief. The original evidence was now protected, accessible only with his key and the bank's master key, safe from theft or destruction. From the bank, he drove to a FedEx office and sent the first set of copies overnight to Daniel Chen's law office in Denver, with signature required. The second set went to a journalist Daniel had recommended, an investigative reporter named Sarah Mitchell, who worked for the Great Falls Tribune, and had a reputation for taking on powerful interests. The third set, Thomas addressed to the Montana Attorney General's office in Helena, with a cover letter he'd written in the truck, explaining the basic facts and requesting immediate investigation. He paid extra for tracking and confirmation of delivery on all 3 packages, and watched as the clerk scanned them and placed them in the outgoing bin. It was done. The evidence was secured and distributed, beyond the reach of Thornhill's power to suppress. Thomas walked out of the FedEx office into the bright morning sunlight, Ranger trotting beside him, and that was when he saw it. The black SUV from the previous night was parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted so dark he couldn't see the driver. As Thomas stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the vehicle, it pulled out of its parking spot and drove slowly past him, close enough that he could have touched it, and the passenger window rolled down just far enough for him to see a man inside, wearing sunglasses, watching him with the cold assessment of a predator measuring prey. The SUV didn't speed away or try to hide. Instead, it drove to the end of the block, made a U-turn, and parked again, positioned so the driver had a clear view of Thomas's truck. The message was unmistakable and chilling. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted him to know he was being watched, that there was nowhere he could go that they wouldn't follow, and that the 48-hour deadline Marcus Thornhill had given him was counting down with the inevitability of a bomb. Thomas drove back toward the ranch with the black SUV maintaining a consistent distance behind him, sometimes close enough to read the license plate in his mirror, sometimes dropping back half a mile, but always there, a constant presence that transformed the 3-hour drive into a nerve-shredding ordeal. The SUV followed him all the way to the turnoff for the ranch road, and only when Thomas made the turn onto the dirt track did the vehicle continue past on the highway. But Thomas knew with cold certainty that its departure meant nothing, that whoever was driving had already accomplished their goal of letting him know he was watched and vulnerable. As his truck bounced down the rutted road toward the ranch buildings, Ranger began to whine, a low, anxious sound that immediately put Thomas on alert, and when they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, he understood why. Something was wrong. The gate that had been standing open when he'd left before dawn was now hanging at an odd angle, and as he got closer, he could see that the padlock he'd secured it with had been cut cleanly through, the severed pieces lying in the dirt. Thomas's heart began to pound as he drove through the gate and into the yard, and the full scope of the vandalism revealed itself. All 4 tires on his truck, the same truck he was currently driving, had been slashed, deep cuts that had let the air out and ruined them beyond repair, which meant this had been done hours ago, shortly after he'd left. But it was the barn that delivered the real message. Across the weathered wood of the main door, someone had spray-painted 2 words in blood-red letters 3 feet high. "Leave now." The paint was still wet in places, dripping down the wood like actual blood, and the sight of it sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ranger exploded out of the truck before Thomas had fully stopped, the dog immediately beginning a frantic patrol of the perimeter, his nose to the ground, his body tense, and his hackles raised. He was tracking scents, following the paths of the intruders, and his agitation spoke volumes about how recently they'd been here, and how many there had been. Thomas pulled out his cell phone, found the number for the Flathead County Sheriff's Department that he'd looked up days ago, and called. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored and irritated. Thomas explained the situation, the vandalism, the threats, the cut lock and slashed tires, and requested immediate assistance. There was a long pause, the sound of typing, and then the dispatcher's voice came back with bureaucratic indifference. "All our deputies are currently responding to a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 2. Someone will get out to your location when available." Thomas pressed, explaining this was an active threat, that he'd been threatened by Marcus Thornhill personally, that this was connected to a serious criminal matter. The dispatcher's tone grew colder. "Sir, I've made a note in the system. Someone will respond when resources are available. That's all I can tell you." Thomas hung up and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its descent. No one came. He called again at 4 p.m. and got the same dispatcher, who told him the call was still in the queue. He called a third time at 7 p.m. and was told the office was closing and he should call back in the morning if he still needed assistance. And Thomas understood with absolute clarity that the local sheriff's department, probably still influenced by Thornhill money, and power, had no intention of helping him at all. The sky began to change in the late afternoon, the clear blue darkening to an ominous bruised purple in the west, and Thomas watched from the porch as towering thunderheads built themselves into massive anvil-shaped monuments that rose thousands of feet into the atmosphere. This was a spring storm of the kind that Montana was famous for, the violent collisions of warm and cold air masses that could drop inches of rain in hours and transform the landscape into a treacherous maze of flash floods and impassable mud. The wind picked up first, gusting hard enough to tear at Thomas's clothes and send tumbleweeds racing across the yard like frightened animals. And then came the first fat drops of rain, heavy as marbles, striking the dry earth with audible impacts. Within minutes, the drops became a deluge, a solid wall of water falling from the sky with such force that visibility dropped to nearly zero. Thomas grabbed his duffel bag with the copies of his father's evidence, called Ranger to his side, and made a run for the old ranch house, the only structure that still had most of its roof intact. The power, what little reached this remote location, had gone out within seconds of the storm's arrival, and when Thomas checked his cell phone, he found what he'd expected. No signal, the storm's interference, and the remote location combining to cut him off completely from the outside world. He was trapped, isolated as completely as if he'd been marooned on a desert island, and the dirt road that connected the ranch to the highway was already beginning to run with water, the hard packed surface turning to slick mud that would be impassable to any vehicle within the hour. Inside the ranch house, Thomas moved with purpose, born of old training, his marine instincts taking over as he assessed the structure's defensive capabilities. The main room was large and open, with windows on 3 sides that were vulnerabilities, but also vantage points. He found old furniture in the other rooms and dragged a heavy oak dresser in front of the main door, wedging it tight. He positioned a wooden table on its side near the largest window, creating a barrier and a shooting rest. In a closet that smelled of dust and mothballs, he found what he'd been hoping for, his father's hunting rifle, a Remington 700 in .30-06, wrapped in an old blanket and still in good condition despite the decades of neglect. More importantly, he found 3 boxes of ammunition, enough to make a stand if it came to that. Thomas loaded the rifle with hands that were steady, despite the fear coiling in his gut, and positioned himself where he could watch the approach to the house. Ranger settled beside him, the dog's earlier agitation transformed into the focused calm of a working animal who understood that danger was imminent. The storm raged outside, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the old house's frame, but Thomas barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the grey curtain of rain, and the growing certainty that Marcus Thornhill's 48-hour deadline had not been arbitrary, that the storm provided perfect cover for men who meant him harm, and that before this night was over, he would be fighting not against weather, but against something far more deadly. The storm had been raging for nearly 2 hours, when Ranger's demeanor changed from watchful calm to aggressive alertness, his body going rigid as a board, his ears snapping forward, and a low, continuous growl beginning to rumble from deep in his chest. Thomas immediately moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass into the darkness, and that was when he saw them. 3 powerful beams of light cutting through the downpour, moving with purpose up the muddy road toward the house. The lights were hand-held flashlights, military-grade by their intensity, and behind each beam was the dark silhouette of a man, 3 figures advancing through the storm with the steady, deliberate pace of people who had a job to do and weren't concerned about being seen. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, his marine training flooding back as he checked the rifle's chamber and moved into position behind the overturned table. The men reached the yard, their lights sweeping across the front of the house, and then a voice called out, amplified to be heard over the thunder and rain, professional and authoritative. "Thomas Mercer, this is Thornhill Security Services. You are trespassing on private property. We have a court order for your immediate removal. Come out now with your hands visible." Thomas didn't move, didn't respond, because he knew with absolute certainty that it was a lie. There was no court order, no legal authority behind these men, just Marcus Thornhill's money and his willingness to use violence to protect his family's secrets. The men advanced closer, and now Thomas could see them more clearly in the lightning flashes. All 3 wore dark tactical clothing, boots, and gear vests, and each carried what looked like a sidearm holstered at their hip. They were professionals, hired muscle who'd done this kind of work before, and their body language spoke of confidence and training. The voice called out again, closer now. "Mr. Mercer, we know you're inside. We have legal authority to remove you by force if necessary. This is your final warning." Ranger's growl intensified, the sound escalating from a rumble to something more savage and threatening, and the dog positioned himself directly in front of the barricaded door, his teeth bared, his entire body coiled and ready to attack. Thomas moved to the side of the window, calling out in a voice that was steady and hard. "I'm the legal owner of this property. You're the ones who are trespassing. Leave now, or I will defend myself." There was a pause, a moment of consultation among the 3 men, and then the lead figure, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face was hidden in shadow, gestured to his companions. "We're coming in. Secure the subject." They split up with practiced efficiency, one moving toward the front door, the other 2 circling to approach from different angles, trying to find the weakest point of entry. The man at the front door didn't knock or wait. Instead, he immediately began trying to force it, throwing his shoulder against the wood, testing the strength of Thomas's barricade. The old door groaned and shuddered but held, the dresser behind it doing its job, but Thomas could hear the frame beginning to splinter. At the same moment, there was a crash from the kitchen as one of the other men smashed through a window, the sound of breaking glass sharp even over the storm's roar. Ranger spun toward the new threat, his barking explosive and furious, while Thomas swung the rifle toward the kitchen doorway, his heart hammering, but his hands steady. The lead man at the front door stepped back, and Thomas heard the distinctive sound of a weapon being drawn, the metallic slide of a pistol being chambered. This was no longer a bluff or an intimidation tactic. This had escalated to lethal force, and Thomas understood that these men had been sent with orders that probably included making sure he didn't survive the night, that his death would be ruled an accident or a justified removal of a trespasser, and that the storm would wash away any evidence of murder. The siege had begun, and Thomas Mercer, 68 years old, and alone, except for his loyal dog, prepared to fight for his life against men who had been sent to ensure his silence was permanent. Thomas made his decision in the split second before the man at the front door could fire first, raising the Remington and aiming not at the man, but at the door itself, 2 feet to the left of where he estimated the intruder stood, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that made his ears ring, and the 30 Mozo 6 round punched through the old wooden door like it was paper, sending splinters flying and leaving a hole the size of a fist. From outside came a startled curse, and the sound of men scrambling away from the house, their bravado shaken by the reality that their target was armed and willing to fight. Thomas worked the bolt, chambering another round, and called out in a voice that carried all the authority of his military years. "The next shot won't be a warning. Leave now, or I will defend this property with lethal force." The response was silence, broken only by the storm's rage, and for several minutes, Thomas and Ranger held their positions, the dog's attention divided between the front door and the broken kitchen window, his growls a constant background rumble. Thomas knew the retreat was temporary, that the men were regrouping, reassessing their tactics, and deciding on their next move. He used the time to improve his defenses, dragging another piece of furniture to block the kitchen doorway, checking his ammunition supply, and positioning himself where he had clear lines of sight to multiple approaches. Ranger moved with him, the dog's behavior shifting into something Thomas had never seen before, a tactical awareness that spoke to training, deeper than he'd realized. The German Shepherd began systematically moving from window to window in a patrol pattern, spending 30 seconds at each position, his nose pressed to the glass, his ears forward, tracking movement outside that Thomas couldn't see or hear. At the east window, Ranger's growl intensified, and Thomas moved to join him, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness. A lightning flash illuminated the yard for a brief moment, and Thomas saw one of the men crouched low, moving along the side of the house, but carrying something in his hand that wasn't a weapon. The man disappeared from view, circling toward the back of the structure, and Ranger immediately moved to the next window to track him, whining now with an urgency that demanded attention. Thomas followed the dog's lead, moving to the rear window just in time to see another flash of lightning reveal two of the men working together, one holding what looked like a large red jerry can, while the other appeared to be pouring something on the ground at the base of the house's foundation. The wind shifted for just a moment, and Thomas caught a smell that cut through even the storm's overwhelming scent of rain and ozone. Gasoline, sharp and unmistakable, and terrifying in its implications. His blood turned to ice as understanding crashed over him like a physical wave. They weren't trying to force their way in anymore, because they'd realized it was too dangerous, that Thomas was armed and positioned defensively, and might actually kill one of them in close combat. So they'd changed tactics to something safer and more certain. They were going to burn him out, were pouring gasoline around the entire perimeter of the house, creating a ring of accelerant that would turn the old dry structure into an inferno within minutes once ignited. It would look like a tragic accident, an old man taking shelter in a decrepit building during a storm, perhaps knocking over a lantern, perhaps having some electrical malfunction, and by the time anyone investigated, there would be nothing left but ash and bones, and conveniently, any evidence he might have had with him would be destroyed as well. Thomas's mind raced through his options, with the cold calculation of a man who'd faced death before and refused to accept it. He couldn't stay inside. Once they lit the fire, he'd have perhaps 60 seconds before smoke inhalation incapacitated him, and maybe 3 minutes before the structure collapsed. He couldn't go out the front, because that's where they'd be waiting with weapons drawn, expecting him to flee the flames directly into their gunfire. The windows were small and high, difficult to escape through quickly, and they'd probably positioned men to cover those exits as well. He was trapped in a burning box of their design, and they knew it, and the casual cruelty of it, the willingness to burn a man alive to protect corporate profits and family legacy, filled Thomas with a rage that burned hotter than any fire they could set. Ranger pressed against his leg, looking up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, trusting completely in his human to find a way out of this impossible situation. And Thomas reached down to grip the dog's collar, feeling the solid warmth of his companion, knowing that whatever happened next, they would face it together, and he would not let this loyal creature die for secrets that weren't even his to protect. Thomas was calculating the impossible geometry of survival, trying to determine which window would give him the best chance of escaping the flames and avoiding the gunfire that would surely follow. When Ranger's head snapped toward the front of the house, and his aggressive growl transformed into something different, a sound of confusion mixed with alertness. Thomas moved to the front window, and through the driving rain, he saw something that made his heart leap with desperate hope. Headlights, multiple sets of them, coming fast up the muddy ranch road. Not one vehicle, but 4, 5, maybe more, their high beams cutting through the storm like searchlights. The 3 men outside saw them too, and Thomas watched as they abandoned their positions immediately, one of them dropping the jerrycan of gasoline in his haste, all 3 figures running towards the tree line on the east side of the property, disappearing into the darkness and the storm like the criminals they were. The lead vehicle, a large SUV with official government plates, skidded to a stop in the muddy yard, and before it had fully stopped, doors were opening and people were emerging, and Thomas could see the letters on their jackets reflected in the vehicle's lights. Montana Attorney General, DEQ, State Police. The cavalry had arrived, and Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief, so profound it was almost painful. He moved the dresser away from the door, Ranger staying protectively close, and opened it to find himself facing a woman in her 40s, wearing a Department of Environmental Quality jacket, her dark hair plastered to her head by the rain, her expression a mixture of urgency and official authority. Behind her stood at least a dozen other people, state investigators, uniformed officers, and what looked like environmental specialists with equipment cases. "Thomas Mercer," she asked, having to shout over the thunder. "I'm Rebecca Stein, Chief Investigator for the Montana DEQ. Are you all right? We got a call that you were in danger." Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his legs unsteady, and gestured toward the perimeter of the house, where the jerrycans of gasoline sat in the mud like evidence of attempted murder. "They were going to burn me alive. 3 men, claiming to be Thornhill Security. They ran when you arrived." Rebecca immediately turned and shouted orders, and several officers took off in pursuit of the fleeing arsonists, their flashlights bobbing through the darkness, while others began documenting the scene, photographing the gasoline cans, the damaged door, the evidence of the siege. Another vehicle pulled up, and a man climbed out, who Thomas recognized instantly despite the years and the rain. Daniel Chen, his old Marine buddy, looking older and grayer, but with the same fierce determination in his eyes. Daniel ran to the porch and grabbed Thomas in a brief, hard embrace. "Jesus, Tom, we almost didn't make it in time. When the journalist broke the story online this afternoon, all hell broke loose. I've been on the phone for 6 hours straight, calling in every favor I've ever earned, and Rebecca's office launched an emergency response. We drove straight through from Helena." Rebecca joined them on the porch, water dripping from her jacket. "Mr. Mercer, the packages you sent arrived this morning. We've been reviewing your father's evidence all day, and I need you to understand something. What you've uncovered is the largest environmental crime case in Montana history. The contamination, the cover-up, the deaths, it's all documented. We're launching a full criminal investigation, effective immediately, and we have warrants being prepared for multiple arrests, including Marcus Thornhill." She paused, her expression grave. "The journalist you sent the documents to, Sarah Mitchell, she published a preliminary story online at 3 p.m. today. It's gone viral. Every major news outlet in the state has picked it up, and the story is already spreading nationally. Thornhill can't suppress this anymore. You've blown it wide open." Thomas felt tears mixing with the rain on his face, and he reached down to rest his hand on Ranger's head, the dog who had started all of this by finding what had been hidden for 30 years. More vehicles were arriving now, news vans with satellite dishes, their crews setting up lights that turned the muddy ranch yard into a stage. Daniel put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Tom, you need to know something else. After Sarah's story went live, we started getting calls, dozens of them, from families all over the valley. People who took the settlement money 30 years ago, who signed non-disclosure agreements. They're all coming forward now. They want to testify. They want justice. Your father's fight didn't die with him. You've given them their voices back." The ranch transformed overnight from an abandoned ruin into the epicenter of what the news networks were already calling the largest corporate environmental crime case in Montana history. and Thomas found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity that left him simultaneously exhausted and energized. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean and sparkling under a brilliant sun that seemed to illuminate not just the land, but the truth that had been buried beneath it for 3 decades. Rebecca Stein and her team from the DEQ had set up a mobile command center in a cluster of RVs and trailers that now filled the ranch yard, their generators humming as technicians processed evidence and coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the state. Thomas sat in one of those trailers, Ranger at his feet, and methodically walked investigators through every document in his father's collection, every entry in the journal, every photograph and laboratory report, watching as their expressions shifted from professional interest to genuine horror at the scope of what Samuel Mercer had documented. By 10 a.m., Montana State Police had arrested the 3 men who'd attempted to burn Thomas alive, catching them trying to flee the state on back roads, their clothing still reeking of gasoline. And by noon, a team of federal marshals and state investigators had arrived at Marcus Thornhill's palatial estate in Whitefish, with arrest warrants charging him with conspiracy to commit murder, witness intimidation, environmental crimes, and a dozen other charges that Daniel explained could result in decades in prison. The arrest was captured by news helicopters, the footage of Marcus Thornhill being led from his mansion in handcuffs broadcast live across the nation, and Thomas watched it on a laptop in the command trailer with a sense of vindication so profound it brought fresh tears to his eyes. But the most remarkable development came not from law enforcement, but from the community itself. Because once Sarah Mitchell's story broke the dam of silence, the flood that followed was unstoppable. Within hours of the article's publication, the DEQ hotline was overwhelmed with calls from families across the valley, people who had lived for 30 years with the burden of their silence, who had watched loved ones die, and had taken Thornhill's money and signed agreements promising never to speak, and who now, emboldened by Thomas's courage and protected by the legal teams that Daniel was assembling, were ready to tell their stories. Roy Hastings was the first to arrive at the ranch in person, the old man driving up in his battered pickup truck and walking straight to Thomas, with tears streaming down his weathered face, asking if it was true, if the nightmare was finally over. And when Thomas confirmed it, Roy collapsed into his arms and sobbed like a child. More families followed throughout the day, a procession of people Thomas didn't know, but who knew his father's name, who remembered Samuel Mercer as the man who had tried to fight and had died for it, and who now wanted to honor his memory by adding their voices to his. The DEQ wasted no time deploying their forensic teams, and by the second day after Thomas's discovery, environmental scientists were fanned out across the valley, taking water and soil samples from hundreds of locations, using ground-penetrating radar to locate the abandoned mine shafts that had been used as illegal dump sites, and setting up monitoring equipment to track the contamination plume through the underground aquifer. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined, worse even than Samuel's meticulous documentation had suggested. The contamination wasn't limited to the immediate area around the Thornhill mining facility. It had spread through the interconnected water table, affecting an area of over 200 square miles, reaching wells and springs and creeks that fed communities throughout 3 counties. Dr. James Morrison, the lead environmental scientist, held a press conference on the 3rd day, at which he displayed maps showing the extent of the damage in stark red shading. And his voice was shaking with barely controlled anger as he explained that this level of contamination would take decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to remediate, and that the health impacts on the population were only beginning to be understood. The State Health Department launched an emergency screening program, offering free medical testing to anyone who had lived in the affected area. And the results were devastating. Elevated cancer rates, neurological problems, kidney disease, birth defects, a catalogue of human suffering that could be directly traced to the poison that Thornhill Mining had deliberately dumped into the ground. Thomas made the request on the 5th day after his father's evidence had come to light, sitting across from Rebecca Stein and a representative from the Montana Attorney General's office, his hands trembling as he spoke the words that had been building in his mind since reading Roy Hastings's suspicions in his father's journal. He wanted his father's body exhumed, wanted a proper autopsy conducted with modern forensic techniques, because he needed to know with certainty whether Samuel Mercer's death had been the natural heart attack it appeared to be, or something far more sinister. Rebecca had looked at him with compassion and professional understanding, explaining that exhumation was a serious step that required court orders and family consent, but that given the evidence of conspiracy and the suspicious timing of Samuel's death just days after receiving the damning laboratory reports, she believed a judge would approve the request. The legal process moved with surprising speed, accelerated by the media attention and the mounting evidence of Thornhill's criminal enterprise, and within a week, Thomas found himself standing in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Cedar Falls on a grey morning that matched his mood, watching as workers in protective suits carefully excavated the grave where his father had rested for 30 years. The casket, when it emerged from the earth, was remarkably well preserved, the seal having protected it from the worst of time's decay, and it was transported under police escort to the state medical examiner's office in Missoula, where a team of forensic pathologists waited to conduct what would be one of the most important autopsies in Montana legal history. Thomas was not allowed to be present for the examination itself, but Daniel Chen called him 3 days later, with results that confirmed his worst fears and Roy's darkest suspicions. Dr. Elizabeth Marks, the chief medical examiner, had found traces of a compound called potassium chloride in tissue samples taken from Samuel's heart, present in concentrations that were far beyond what could occur naturally in a decomposing body. Potassium chloride, Daniel explained in a voice tight with controlled rage, was a favorite tool of sophisticated assassins because when injected in sufficient quantities, it caused immediate cardiac arrest that was virtually indistinguishable from a natural heart attack, especially in 1994, when forensic techniques were less advanced, and when a rural coroner performing a routine autopsy on a 62-year-old rancher would have had no reason to look for it. Samuel Mercer had been murdered, killed by someone with access to medical knowledge and the willingness to commit cold-blooded homicide, and the timing, just 3 days after he'd received the laboratory results that would have destroyed Thornhill Mining, left no doubt about who had ordered his death. But the investigation didn't stop with Samuel's murder, because once the exhumation results became public, the State Attorney General's office launched a comprehensive review of all deaths in the valley during the 1990s, and what they uncovered painted a picture of corruption that was breathtaking in its scope and depravity. Sheriff William Dutch, the man who had promised to investigate Samuel's allegations and had instead returned with Thornhill's lawyers and threats, had been receiving monthly payments from Thornhill Mining, totaling over $400,000 during his tenure, the money hidden in accounts under his wife's name, and discovered only through forensic accounting that traced the flow of funds from corporate slush accounts. Dutch had died in 2003, taking his secrets to the grave, but his corruption lived on in the files and records that investigators now pried open, revealing that he had actively covered up at least 5 suspicious deaths between 1993 and 1995, deaths of people who had either worked for Thornhill Mining and knew about the illegal dumping, or who had, like Samuel, been preparing to go public with evidence of the contamination. Each death had been ruled accidental or natural, the investigations perfunctory at best, and in 2 cases, evidence had simply disappeared from the sheriff's office, logged in but never logged out, vanished into the void of deliberate destruction. The revelation that the very institution meant to protect the community had been corrupted at its highest level sent shockwaves through the valley, and Thomas watched as the edifice of Thornhill's power, built over decades through money and intimidation and murder, finally crumbled under the weight of truth that could no longer be suppressed. 6 months after that storm-swept night when Thomas had nearly died in flames, the Montana landscape looked much the same on the surface. But beneath it, everything had changed in ways both tangible and profound. Marcus Thornhill sat in a federal detention facility, awaiting trial on charges that included conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, witness intimidation, and racketeering. His bail denied after prosecutors argued convincingly that he posed a flight risk given his wealth and international connections, and his corporate empire, Thornhill Development Corporation, had filed for bankruptcy protection as lawsuits from hundreds of victims overwhelmed its assets and insurance carriers. The company's stock had become worthless overnight. Its board of directors had resigned en masse, and its headquarters building in Kalispell now stood empty with a for sale sign that no one seemed interested in answering. The contaminated sites across the valley had become the focus of the largest environmental cleanup operation in Montana history, with the Environmental Protection Agency designating the entire affected area as a Superfund site and allocating $340 million in initial funding for remediation efforts that would span decades. Teams of environmental engineers worked around the clock, pumping and treating contaminated groundwater, excavating poisoned soil, sealing the abandoned mine shafts that had served as illegal dumps, and installing monitoring wells to track the progress of the cleanup. And while the work was slow and painstaking, there was finally hope that the land could heal, that future generations might drink clean water from wells that had been poisoned by corporate greed. A victims' compensation fund had been established through a combination of Thornhill's seized assets, insurance, settlements, and state appropriations, totaling over $180 million and growing as additional liable parties were identified, and Daniel Chen's legal team was working with over 200 families to document their losses and secure compensation, not just for medical expenses, but for pain, suffering, and the years of silence they had been forced to endure. Roy Hastings had been one of the first to receive a settlement, and the old man had broken down sobbing in Daniel's office, not because of the money, but because someone had finally acknowledged what had been done to his wife, had finally said out loud that her death had not been random chance, but murder by negligence. And that acknowledgement, that validation of 3 decades of grief and guilt, was worth more than any check. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was happening at the Mercer Ranch itself, where Thomas had made the decision that surprised everyone except those who knew him best. He could have sold the property, could have taken the money, and disappeared to somewhere warm and easy where the past couldn't find him. But instead he chose to stay, to rebuild, to transform the place where his father had died, fighting into something that would ensure that fight continued. With funding from environmental organizations, historical societies, and donations from people across the country who had been moved by Samuel Mercer's story, Thomas had begun the work of restoration, not to return the ranch to its cattle ranching past, but to create something entirely new. The old barn, with its spray-painted warning still visible on the weathered wood, was being carefully preserved as part of the historical record, while the main house was being rebuilt from its foundation up, designed to serve as an education center and museum. The center would be called the Samuel Mercer Environmental Justice Institute, and it would tell the story not just of one man's fight against corruption, but of the broader struggle for environmental protection, corporate accountability, and the right of communities to know what poisons were being put in their air and water. Thomas had hired local contractors for the work, bringing jobs back to a valley that had lost so much, and he'd brought in educators and activists to help design exhibits and programs that would teach future generations about the cost of silence and the power of one person's courage. On the wall of what would become the main gallery, workers were installing a blown-up photograph of Samuel Mercer, and Thomas stood before it each morning, looking into his father's eyes and making a silent promise that the truth Samuel had died protecting would never be buried again. Thomas stood on the porch of the restored ranch house on an evening in late September, nearly a year after that first return, and watched as the setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The house behind him was no longer a decaying ruin, but a solid structure that served as both home and headquarters, for the Samuel Mercer Environmental Justice Institute, its walls filled with the documentation of his father's fight and the ongoing struggle for environmental protection. At his feet lay Ranger, the German shepherd, whose frantic digging had set everything in motion, stretched out with the contentment of a job well done. The dog was greyer now around his muzzle, but his eyes remained sharp, and occasionally he would lift his head to survey the property, with what Thomas recognized as satisfaction, as if understanding that his mission was finally complete. The creek bed where Ranger had dug up the metal lockbox now ran with clean water again, tested weekly by DEQ monitors who confirmed the contamination levels were dropping steadily. Thomas had knelt by that water just yesterday, cupped his hands to drink, the simple act a reclamation of what had been stolen. Roy Hastings visited at least twice a week now, along with other families who had lost loved ones to the contamination, people who found comfort and purpose in ensuring their stories were told. Marcus Thornhill and his executives faced decades in prison, and the company that had terrorized the valley existed only as a cautionary tale. Thomas had returned expecting to sign papers and walk away forever, but instead he had found his father's voice speaking across the decades, had uncovered a truth that demanded to be told, and in fighting for that truth he had discovered redemption, purpose, and home. The ghosts that had haunted this land had been laid to rest, not through forgetting, but through remembering, through the hard work of dragging truth into light. Thomas reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's head, understanding that this scarred and healing place was where he was meant to be, and that sometimes the longest journey home takes you back to where you started, not to reclaim what was lost, but to build something new from the ashes.